Welcome to our next video in this series of the rise of the eco-guards. This is an acknowledgement and a big thank you to a former resident of Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada, Miss Michaela McLeod, as well as to the University of Waterloo for releasing this exceptional thesis for public viewing consumption, for all her diligent work involved in the production of your important documented and photographic thesis entitled The Causeway, the Landfill, and the River, Shaping Moncton's Environs, by Michaela McLeod, a thesis presented to the University of Waterloo in fulfillment of the thesis requirement for the degree of Master of Architecture in Architecture, but also shows the imagings that are now being concealed by many as it relates to the Petitcodiac River, the Petitcodiac Lake, and its riverside landfills, as well as the many effects that have occurred and those that are also ongoing. Anyways, I wish you great success in your chosen fields of studies and all your life's goals. Again, thanks for what you have all done in creating and releasing this thesis, but also thanks for also giving me the only one and great source for some of the images used in this video production. Stand on guard with me. The Call to Serve Canada. Part 2. Section B. Altered Attributes. In that last part of our series, Part 2, Section A, I described some of the reasons and many other accomplishments that I was somewhat quietly involved with and went on concerning those actions of service. And then left off several decades after the closure of the Moncton City Riverside garbage dumps, and began to describe what we believed were further unjustified and possibly damaging actions by another so-called environmental group that was brought in from the United States. In any event, while we were still analyzing, determining, and conducting many other eco-based endeavors in New Brunswick over all those years, and how to be extremely effective at our goals, things took a turn for what some would consider the betterment of our Petitcodiac River and ecosystems, but truly turned out to be something else. Another group from the United States of America, by the title of the River Keepers, eventually came to our tri-community area with the help of several local individuals, and they attempted over several years to have that causeway gate system completely and permanently opened in order to allow larger fish species to travel further upstream, and did also eventually push to legally force the federal, the provincial governments and city council to remove the causeway linking Moncton and Riverview and replace it with a limited bridge structure. Moreover, there always seemed to be more going on in the background with all their confusing actions as it relates to that river system, but I cannot quite put my fingers on it. Nevertheless, that causeway just happened to be right adjacent to those excessively or massively deep and large polluting landfill sites, and was acting as a complete barrier in order to prevent a great many toxic elements from traveling further upstream and affecting a great many other life forms that had come to call that Petitcodiac Lake system their home. That said, when we eventually were made aware of what they were doing, we voiced our opinions and concerns about not permanently opening the causeway gates, which was actually their first goal. But our concerns fell upon deaf ears. In fact, we were not even asked to participate in any review or court challenge. The reason we were so concerned was because of all our past field analyses, diagnoses, and justified determinations within those extensive physical functional attributes, otherwise known as our field studies, that we had personally conducted for a great many years, actually going back to the early 1970s and 1980s. And that was also regardless of all our other objections to those types of actions prior to what we required as the full properly extensive quarantinings of those dump sites all along that river system. For those dumps extend further downstream, but mostly through the downtown riverbank area. Nevertheless, over time, even these so-called river keepers began to see the truth of their own actions and began taking samples of those toxins for analysis through whatever universities or government-assisted sources they could. Over time, several federal government agencies and the courts penalized both the provincial government and the city of Moncton, as well as their engineering firm involved for what had transpired. But those actions, I truly found to be very strange, for that same entity is responsible for allowing, or should I say licensing, any such dumps or landfills. It just seemed like no one truly wanted or even wants to do anything about that devastating ecological nightmare. All you bureaucrats are unbelievable. But since that was the case, then all three communities should have been held to account, and they all should have been made to pay for those proper quarantinings. For those dumping sites, otherwise known as landfills, were used by all. Even more so now, within the Barry's Mills landfill site, that's been renewed beyond its life expectancy, and is in and of itself another ticking ecological devastation on the horizon. Anyhow, their actions also cause the destructions of other ecosystems. For those sites could only be quarantined, not truly cleaned up in any other manner. I'll describe these facts as we go along. Really not much different than the former causeway structure in its overall footprint, but this new bridge would allow much more tidal currents to flow up and downstream, thereby eventually allowing for the erosion of the riverbanks around those landfill areas. And those unjustified actions destroyed a freshwater lake and extensive ecosystems that had beautifully developed or backwater system. As some idiots and so-called paper-pushing professors with no field studies or other works in proper extensive observational explorations like to call it. Now that brings up another interesting fact. If that upper Petitcodiac water body was not a lake, then how could Jones Lake in the center city be considered that, for it was just a small winding creek many years before the causeway was even built, and has now developed into its own man-made, beautiful, energetic ecosystems, full of fish species, bird species, and so much more. Not just a swamp, full of insects and minimal or smaller bird species. And you don't see or hear of the so-called riverkeepers attempting to open up that lake's dam system and completely restoring Jonathan Creek to its former state, for it's part of that river system. At any rate, that Petitcodiac freshwater body had been in place and had developed for over 5 decades by that time, and the habitats for a great many animals and fish species like very large schools of smelts were all destroyed once the causeway gates were opened in 2010, and then were completely removed years later. For a fish ladder was incorporated into that causeway system years before, but the removal of that lake did also cause all property values upstream to be devalued. For the once pleasant area and recreational water body looks like a mud patch, and the mosquitoes are beyond belief. Nice going, you so-called river keepers, creating the potential for spreading the West Nile scenario or worse. But that was not all. By draining that very large freshwater Petitcodiac lake system, they have caused all the large bird species whom resided there, such as the mallard ducks and Canada geese, to seek out other areas for nesting, feeding, and nurturing their young. And it just so happens that now they are finding places within the central city core and creating other types of problems, all on their own. Just another great thing, or result of the incompetence of people who have no real clue of what they do. Moreover, they all claim that the river's tidal bore wave size has risen since that causeway was removed, when the clear video images from very early 1960, before the causeway was placed there, shows a much smaller tidal bore wave size. Anyways, the points that are being expressed relate to a river system that's dying, and most of that is because of those former landfills all along that riverbank, but also because of all the scientifically proven facts that the river deposit sediments are circulating in place and then constantly coming up the river from the Chesapeake Bay area, but have also been placed there from another source. I'll get into that soon. By the way, don't be deceived, for they will also attempt to show you images where it appears like the river's width had decreased since the causeway was put in place in 1966 to 68, when the fact remains, it has not. These altered and represented images show what they'll attempt to describe, but other more accurate images show the truth. For when the tide is down, there's really no difference. When it's up at certain times and intervals of the year, the river looks wider. It's a trick that many so-called environmental people use in manipulating the public into supporting their causes with all their hard-earned money. Very similar to what transpired years ago, when governments took the advice of the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, when he narrated An Inconvenient Truth. For that movie was based on flawed computer modeling with inaccurate and fake data from systems that had been fed limited data sets. And that's really no surprise, for not many people upon the Earth truly comprehend how the planet truly works, wherein everything is affected by a greater series of unseen and unpredictable powers. And yes, even spiritual forces have their effects as well. Now try predicting those forces. And no computer will truly be able to predict with any certainty the true effects of any devastating ecological factors. For computers are truly dumb machines. And I know this to be true, for I've been trained to work on those and have studied and worked on these types of mechanisms for a great deal of time. In fact, so much time that I can also clearly state that you're all being deceived with their claim about artificial intelligence. For it's all programming in nature, and there's nothing intelligent other than the people writing the code to make it do what it does. But those deceptions continue, even now, as those realities toward our own government attempting to control the masses of Canadian citizens with punishing carbon taxes that will never cause any real changes to the climate, and those changes that will occur regardless of anyone's actions. And the Riverkeepers' actions are no different, for it's easily proven by their own images. For several of those, show the width of the river is so wide it's covering the Albert Street portion leading to the old Gunningsville Bridge, actually being covered by water at high tide. The deceptions are unreal and unfounded and unjustified. But I'll continue to state these facts. There's really only one way to save that river system, but no one wants to conduct those actions. The constant work involved would be part of an overall betterment for a Tri-City region that's going to keep growing for decades, if not centuries. And they did this all to attempt to bring the Atlantic salmon and several other larger species of fish stocks to that tidal river system. In other words, all done for the pleasure of anglers and bitter old men, unknown to them all, that even if they eventually do achieve that goal, it's not likely anyone would want to eat those fish, mostly because of any potential toxic contamination issues that may or will most likely be present in that fish species, again from the toxic spewing from those many landfills that are banked along that downtown river system. But even further to those concerns are these. If they succeed, the potential to also contaminate any other wild Atlantic salmon stocks that are currently not affected, by eventually introducing those fish stocks that they are releasing into that river system that will then become contaminated, thereby affecting those gene pools, but also possibly affecting other river systems all around the Fundy Bay area, and even further, possibly as far as the state of Maine, and further down the Atlantic coast. For there's no guarantee that those released and raised fish will later spawn in that river system, for they just destroyed any potential for the upper freshwater streams, ponds, and lakes that would be required. That's part of the reason why, when it comes to properly protecting any ecosystems or wild animals, fish or birds, they should leave it to the people in those areas that know those things and life forms best. That said, they should also stop surfing those waters, for those attempting or doing these actions are also placing themselves and others in a potentially greater harm's way, while exposing themselves to toxic elements that are too numerous to truly understand, wetsuit or not. It's all done for the attention they seek. Look closely at where they begin their surfing excursions. It's always around the bend of the river, around the DFNB area, not further down the river, where they can be seen by the public and be helped if needed. But also understand these many true facts. That river system is declining and dying a slow death, and all the proof was observable prior to any causeway being built. For the city of Moncton and surrounding areas were once a place for shipbuilding long ago. Now, why do you think that stopped? And that is brought on by a great many factors, from the once deep channel filling in with sediments, to land erosions created by the forestry sectors, to all the riverbank farming that's being conducted, and causing further more intense sediments to find their ways into our unique river systems. But that's also why, when it comes to truly comprehending what's transpiring, it can only be achieved with an overall comprehensive approach that includes far more of all ecological, economic, and educational principles and matters than just opening or removing every causeway or dike system that have previously been put in place. And they do this not for our ecologies. It's all for this fact, so that these river keepers can then have their claim to fame as the so-called restorers of any river system. For many of those constructed causeways, dikes, and any other barriers were placed there for reasons that many of these so-called riverkeepers don't understand. From a form of control mechanism for rainwater runoff, to helping in the preventions of land degradations, mitigations of flooding events, and so much more. But of course, they don't talk to others, or even about those many facts. As it relates to all these other factors, they just push their further BS agendas upon free-thinking peoples and governments that are too scared to stand up to these imps. That said, no one hears any of them speaking about those facts, or even the potentials to truly renew or effectively revive that river system in a manner that would truly benefit all peoples, animals, and ecologies, let alone the future of all our affected communities. It's only about that current river system and the fish stocks that they want that they don't truly understand. And believe this, it's easily provable by observing all their menial actions. Moreover, there's also something wrong within the manners in which they seem to receive all the accolades from a great many other groups, including from governments that they once opposed. For we know of many others whom have achieved a great many eco-based actions and successes for our communities and the world, and none of them received any recognitions. But that's all right, because it was never about that. It was about truly protecting all the natural places and things in order that these generations, as well as future generations, may thrive in as pristine an ecological area as possible. For the true green agenda was always about humanity and our ecology first before big business and corporate greed. That said, the eco-guards warned them all that conducting any of those actions without first properly quarantining those previous landfill sites could or would cause a further destructive series of events to unfold because of all the toxic elements that could then continuously flow into the Fundy Basin at an accelerated rate, which were taking place by that time anyways, mostly because of the erosion of those riverbanks and dump sites that the surface rainfalls had caused, but also would transpire once the tidal water flows increased. But of course, all these so-called environmental people never get it right. But that's also what misdirected monies can do, for it blinds those that should see the truth, and causes people that truly don't perceive their aggressive environmental actions as destructive. I could go on at great lengths about these events and any possible solutions that would not only benefit our ecosystems, but also our economies, eventually our tourist sectors, and even our homeless issues, and mitigate our climate change footprint as well. But I'll leave that for another time. But I will say, keep watching, and you'll learn of the place where you can read all about it, while hopefully later also having the ability to view those same literary works as they are revised into exceptional digital video works, while also witnessing the true lengths that would truly be needed to be accomplished to properly quarantine of any such sites, while possibly attaining a clean enough river system that could then be restocked with wild Atlantic salmon and other species of fish, but would also include an upper lake system, thereby preventing further degradations of the Fundy Basin, while also creating a beautiful downtown core, a lake system with the eventual abilities for recreational pleasure craft and fish spawning grounds that are required anyways. But that quarantining effort would be very expensive, for they would need to truly encapsulate and cap those former landfills with 100-foot deep steel and concrete walls around their circumference, with incorporated seepage pumping systems built into those channeled walls for the treatment of the leachings, while completely capping those sites with 4 to 6 feet of 5,000 psi concrete, with incorporated valve systems for the venting and extractions of any useful power production elements, but also capturing any more extensive and potent climate-altering gases, such as methane, thereby also totally preventing any penetration of surface waters into those quarantining units. And that would also affect, but also limit the toxic leachings in another manner. I could go on in greater detail, but I think you get the points of it. But also understand, there are many other true climate change effects that are not only transpiring, mostly because of all the human-made contributions of methane that's spewing from all those landfill sites, including the current sites that are all being mismanaged. Anyways, we or I also helped in making, educating, or helping people in gaining the enlightenments as it relates to our balanced eco-guards goals, purposes, and endeavors at Special Canada Day events, as well as many other international events, while wearing my several versions over the years of my handmade repurposed solid laminated plastic and Kevlar Captain Patriot armors, also known as Eco Prime, or by previously successfully serving as an assistant manager in several other not-for-profit Christian-based organizations in the late 1970s and early 1980s, whom were dedicated to helping peoples that were transient and homeless, who also had addictions and mental health issues. Actually, long before all governments were financially helping at all, or even considered those efforts a necessity or what they now consider a human-based industry. And believe this, I learned a great deal about many peoples, including those opposed to all our efforts and successes, but also how to manage such facilities as well as in the attaining of larger quantities of food to feed those in need. And that was before any food bank existed in Moncton. These efforts and knowledge would also be taught or passed down to another group that would later expand and take on a greater burden as the need was increasing in our small city. To the many others, such as helping in forming Moncton's first permanent soup kitchen in our current times, entitled the Caring Kitchen, which was first located at St. James Anglican Church on St. George Street in Moncton, NB, and then later relocating on Alma Street. Anyhow, eventually all our past actions of the Christian Home Centers and our justifiable efforts in these communities to help alleviate the most pressing current-day human calamities for as many transient and homeless peoples as possible were very much minimized by many others, and that fact directly interfered with our overall goals to serve in these communities. Nevertheless, we would eventually communicate and pass down to many other new groups of somewhat like-minded caring souls the knowledge we had learned and gained, but not because we cared not to do those important efforts and goals any longer. Thankfully, for a great many years, several other local and national groups of dedicated souls rose to the challenges to fill all these necessary functions and needs, some with our support and some by their own initiatives, and later some with government supports. And truly, not without some controversies and wrong manners of accomplishing their goals. And that's part of the reason for the next in these series of these videos. While eventually another private not-for-profit series of groups or offshoots of the CHC, known as GEMCO Incorporated 1990, and all its other now combined divisions, such as the Eco Guards organizations and Asgardian ministries, continued in a different manner to help with the human condition and preserving and protecting all our important ecosystems, while still helpfully educating many concerning our balanced eco-based goals. Nevertheless, these areas of helping with our different community and worldwide needs were still important multifaceted series of endeavors that in and of themselves would guide and touch lives within our local communities as well as across the entire country and even the world, but in a somewhat different series of useful manners with less stressful outcomes for all those involved and without heavy religious overtones or stern ideological natures, but mostly with proper spiritual and human values being observed. Next time, stand on guard with me. The Call to Serve Canada. Part 2, Section C. Hopes and our home sweet homes.